Hi there, and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and what do we do on this here channel? Well, on this channel, we talk about the hobby, of course. Sometimes we talk about the lore, the background of the hobby itself, how models have evolved over the years, book reviews, codex reviews, all sorts of stuff. So there's a bit of something for everyone. And on today's video, as you can probably tell by the title, we're talking all about the contrast paints and the shades. And is it possible that the contrasts are going to replace the shade paints? Well, it's been floating around for a little while now, and this is just a few reasons why they might, a few reasons how they already have in some respects, but also a few reasons why they might not. And for today's model, we are going to be painting this right here today. Indeed, many contrasts and shades to be used on this model, maybe not. But in any case, without further ado, let's crack on. I think it's fair to say that time really has proven the validity of the contrast paints. When they first arrived a couple of years ago, they were very quickly dismissed by a lot of people as being only really for beginners and not having a huge amount of value. But as time has gone by, I think it's fair to say they really have, for want of a better word, proven their worth. Contrast paints have added quite a lot both to the artistry around Games Workshop's models, but have also added new ways of painting models. There's been new techniques, there's new styles. Everything has actually changed from the arrival of the contrast paints in more subtle ways than I think isn't always given credit for. And this is a good thing. Sometimes when things arrive, it's immediately assumed that they're going to be have a massive impact on the scene, and they don't. But in this case, contrast definitely have, and I believe will continue to do so. But obviously this is more about the effect contrast has had. This doesn't talk about them and their relationship with the shade paints, or other paints for that matter. So let's talk about it. Well, let's start off with a few reasons as to why contrasts could replace shades in the future. First of all, there's nearly twice as many contrast paints now as there are shade paints. So between the shades covering things such as Nuln Oil, Agrax Earthshade, Rakarth Flesh, Carabao Crimson, they cover all the bases, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, if there's one thing they don't have a lot of is range. In fact, if you go and look at the list of all of the various shades out there, there are 3 different shades of green and only really 1 shade of everything else. Whereas when you look at the contrasts, there's multiple shades and ranges for absolutely everything. Yes, some of them are brighter, some of them are darker, some of them have much richer colours, some of them are a bit paler, but ultimately the contrast paints do have a lot more in terms of the range of colours they cover. And as I said, because the shade paints, 1 in every 6 is a green shade, you don't have to worry about that so much with contrast because there's more of it. And the other thing to remember with contrast paints, and this is going back to the simple side of things, they were obviously meant to be paints unto themselves. You were meant to obviously put them over your Wraithbone or Grey Seer base coat, and that would be it. That would be enough. So there is also the argument that because the colour and the tone is stronger, you can actually water it down if you need to, or you can add thinner layers to it to create extra depth and extra shadow. I know that's a very technical point, but it is a point to be mentioned here, I think. Whereas with the shade paints, you can't really make them any stronger than they already are. And obviously when you water them down too much, they start to lose a little bit of their colour overall and may not have the desired effect that you want. So when we put those 2 points together, the fact that there are more shade paints out there, but they can also be diluted to a much greater extent, then that shows you that you've got more of it and you can do a bit more with it. So ultimately that is a bit more useful. And it is arguable that you can tie shade paints a bit more closely to the classic paints when you use them in this capacity as well. If you do start watering down or adding Lamy and Medium to the regular layer paints, you can create something which is equivalent to a shade anyway. And this does actually work quite nicely in and of itself. And they do complement the contrasts in their own way, which is also worth noting. And the other thing to bear in mind with this is that contrast paints can be used for both layering and shading. As I'm sure many of you have probably seen, there's a couple of fantastic tutorials out there for things such as Ultramarines, Blood Angels, and even some other things such as the Alpha Legion and the Stormcast Eternals, which use the shade paints, which use the contrasts as layers, but also as the shades for them as well. So when you're able to use both effectively to fulfill 2 different roles, then that does show how much range they actually have as a group of paints. And again, if we go back to shades, this is something shades aren't meant to do. But again, we'll get to this specifically later on. But another thing just to make a point on the shades is that aside from Cryptek Armor Shade Gloss, which came out specifically for the Necrons last year, we haven't actually seen as many new shades as we have contrasts over the years. There have been new contrast paints released slowly after the contrast range was released a couple years ago, but ultimately the shades themselves have only had 1 additional update, whereas we do still occasionally see new contrast paints. We see more regular classic style paints than we do. We see a new one for practically every major new release when it comes to the editions, but we haven't seen the same thing with the shades to the same degree, apart from the aforementioned Cryptek. And obviously when it comes to the contrast paints, because they have a greater range, it obviously means they have greater utility across all of the armies. Now, I think it's fair to say there are some armies that you would never use certain shades for, and certain colour schemes you'd never use shades for, and we don't need to go into that. But with the contrast paints, because it, again, has that bigger range, you'll probably have a bit more use for most of them somewhere in your army than you will for some of the shades. And that's very much a horses for courses question, but it's something to think about. What would you rather have? A much larger range wherein you could probably find something for everything in your army, or a much smaller range, but you have something which is a bit more all-purpose when it comes to things like Agrax Earthshade and Null Oil, but then a big chunk of them which you would probably not need unless you're doing a very specific kind of army. So if we summarise the reasons very quickly why we might see contrasts replacing shades, or at least why they could replace shades, it really comes down to a greater range, more variation in the colours, greater utility across all of the ranges of Games Workshop's models, as well as a slightly greater capacity for depth and shadow, and can be diluted further to create more interesting colours, and can be used for that as well in both shading, layering and glazing, which is something shades can't do necessarily. But here's a few reasons as to why we may not see contrast replacing shades, and perhaps a few reasons why the shades are still perfectly valid to use. So first of all, the shades are purpose-built, whereas the contrast paints can perform double duties, but you do need to water them down in order to do that in some cases. And the shades, because they are designed to be used as that, shades, they're designed to shade things down, to be used as glazes, and occasionally to be used in some respects for technical things as well, is that you know exactly what you're going to get each time, and you don't have to worry about doing much work with the paint itself. And the other reason is that whilst I'm saying all of this, I'm saying this from experience, and I'm saying this from having seen people with more experience than me work with this sort of thing as well. So to use contrasts as shades and to use them in the way I've described them definitely requires a bit of experience. For newer players, it's the sort of thing which could very easily get them lost, get them confused, whereas shades are much simpler and easier to use and are a bit more user-friendly. Whereas contrasts, you need to know what you're doing a little bit more before you go into them. Unless, obviously, you're using them for the original purpose they were designed for. They were designed to be used as a one-thick coat way to paint your models up nice and quickly. And if you're a new player, that's probably the best way to use them. But for older players who've been able to experiment with their colours a bit more, obviously they can do a little bit more with them. But again, if you don't have that experience, it might not be that easy to make that leap quite as quickly. But at the same time, the other thing to remember is that even though there are more contrasts out there, the shade paints haven't been rolled back. When things start to disappear, we tend to see them very slowly being removed from the range, or being removed from the range all at once quickly after the thing that was designed to replace them appears. That hasn't really happened with the shades. They are still there and they do still have a purpose. Obviously because they are purpose-built, and obviously because they are easy to use, as I've said. And that means that it's very unlikely that the shade paints themselves are going to completely replace the contrast paints anytime soon. It is possible we will see more thinned-down versions of the contrast paints that are contrast light perhaps in the next couple of years. But for the time being, because the contrast paints are still here, along with the shade paints, it would lead someone to believe that the shades themselves aren't going to be phased out. And then the last thing I think it's fair to say as to why the shade paints probably aren't going to be removed entirely is they are still very useful, but ultimately they do still have slightly more utility than I think we always give them credit for. And what I mean by that is they aren't just useful to use on models, they're also more useful on things such as terrain. They're useful for basing, and they're definitely very useful to complement the technical paints. And I'm talking about things such as Typhus Corrosion, Sword of Tesseract Glow, and obviously Nurgle's Rot. They all have their uses in order to help shade, or perhaps even in some cases ever so slightly embolden the colours of those. And then of course there are the glosses as well, which are quite useful for bringing out things such as eyes, lenses, and headlights on vehicles. They definitely still have their uses there, and probably shouldn't be knocked for that purpose if absolutely nothing else. And I think it's fair to say that when it comes to other things such as Blood for the Blood God, that will do fine on its own, and that doesn't really need to go either way, because it was obviously just, blood texture, and that's it. So, to summarise very quickly, the reason we probably won't see shades disappear is they do still have their utility, and they haven't gone anywhere either. And I think it's fair to say that even though you probably may only use one or two of the shades, such as Agrax Earthshade and Null Oil, for the purposes of what you need for simplicity, and if you don't want to use the contrast paints, those haven't gone anywhere, and they are still useful, and their purpose still remains unchanged. Whereas I feel like contrast paints had to somewhat establish themselves when they first arrived. And it's good that contrasts have been able to prove that they can be used for people at every level, but ultimately that was something which was always going to take time anyway. So, to summarise overall, if the contrasts were to replace the shades, what would that actually mean?
For one thing, it would mean a slightly more technically heavy way of approaching paints, which is something Games Workshop has worked very hard to make as easy as possible to access. And to remove shades entirely would probably mean that painting would become more complicated. Ultimately, the shades are a much better way of helping people get into painting to make things look presentable and look good early on, simply because they don't require that much maintenance to make presentable on models. Whereas contrast paints, if you want to use them in the way they're meant to be used as one thick coat, then they can be used in that way very easily. But to use them for anything more advanced does require a slightly stronger knowledge of how the paints themselves actually work in practice, and that's probably the thing which will stop contrasts from taking over the shades entirely, or from the shades disappearing altogether too quickly. But as ever, let me know what you guys think. Do you think contrasts could replace the shades in time? Do you think the shades need a few more additions, or do you think they needed some changes unto themselves in their own way? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you.
So those are my thoughts on the contrasts and shade paints, and to see if one of them is going to replace the other in the foreseeable future. Maybe it will happen, maybe it won't, maybe they'll both change for all we know. But thank you all very much for watching. I post my videos on Wednesdays and Fridays, and if you want to scroll down below, you can see things such as my Patreon, my Instagram page with all the lovely models I've painted over the years, as well as my website for the services I provide in case you're interested. But thank you all very, very much for watching. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.